Hello there and welcome to this Festive Tech Calendar 2022 session. My name is Andy Cutler and we're going to be going through the 12 days of Synapse Analytics. In that top right corner you'll see a QR code. If you scan that, that'll take you through to the Just Giving fundraising page for the Missing People charity. So it's called Find Every Child and it's a great cause. Just a little bit about me. My name is Andy Cutler. I'm an independent business intelligence and data warehousing consultant. I work predominantly with the Azure Data Platform and Power BI. The QR code will take you to my Twitter. So if you scan that, any questions about anything, hey, I love a good conversation about Synapse Analytics. And I mostly blog at serverlesssql.com. And we start on day one with Synapse Workspace. So I'm in my Azure portal and I already have 5 Synapse Analytics workspaces set up. You can have multiple workspaces per subscription. I can easily create a workspace by clicking in the top left on Create, and I can fill in a few pieces of information, including the subscription that I would like that Synapse workspace created in, pick a resource group or create a new one. I can give the workspace a name and choose the region that that workspace is created in. And I can set up an associated Data Lake Gen 2 account that's connected to that Synapse workspace. What I'll do is I'll open up an existing workspace and we can see the components and services within that workspace. So I'm going to open up the Synapse Analytics Studio. So when we log in, we can see we've got several tabs on that left-hand side. I'm just going to expand those tabs. We have a home screen and we can jump straight in to loading some data or to visualize some data in Power BI. We also have a knowledge center as well. If I go into the Data tab on the left-hand side, this is where I can see all of my databases associated with my workspace. So if I expand SQL Database, I can see dedicated SQL Pools databases, and I can see Serverless SQL Pools databases and the associated objects within those databases. I can also see lake databases that are created as part of a Spark workload or through the database designer itself. I also have Data Explorer databases as well. If I click into my linked area, I can see the storage accounts that are associated to my Synapse workspace, and I can actually go and browse those workspaces if I click into, let's say, one of the containers, and then I can start browsing down. We'll look at develop and integrate in other days in our 12 days of Synapse. But that's a brief overview of Synapse Workspaces and the Synapse Studio. On day 2, we have dedicated SQL Pools. Now I'm back in my Synapse Workspace in Synapse Studio. I already have a dedicated SQL pool created, but to create one is a very simple process. I can go up into my SQL pools, click New, enter a name for my dedicated SQL pool. I can set the performance level, which affects the price. So we can move the slider left and right. We've got some additional settings there in terms of do we want to create it from a backup, and collation settings as well. It's fairly simple to set up a dedicated SQL pool. Now from here, I can load data into that dedicated SQL pool. So I'm going to go into my develop area, open up my SQL scripts, and for dedicated SQL pools, I can run a copy into command. Now the copy into command actually allows me to connect to data external to dedicated SQL pools and load that data in. Now I've got the auto create table set to on, and this is supported for Parquet file types. And what I can do is, if I switch to my dedicated SQL pool and I select my database, I can actually run that copy into command. So I'll do that now. So I'll run that copy into, and that should take a few seconds to load, about 3 seconds. I can also create tables in dedicated SQL pools, and I've specified the distribution. Now there are 3 types of distribution in dedicated. I can choose round robin, replicate, or hash. So I've chosen round robin, which evenly distributes the rows around the dedicated SQL pools databases themselves. So I'm going to create a table to hold web telemetry data. So I'm going to run that command. It takes less than a second to create that table. And again, I can use the copy into command, point to some data in my data lake. I'm going to load a day's worth of telemetry data from this folder. So if I run that copy into, that's going to connect to the data lake, and it's going to load that Parquet data into the dedicated SQL pools table itself. So we'll let that run for a few seconds. Okay, now that that data has been loaded in, I can query the 2 tables. The data has been imported into the tables within the dedicated SQL pool. So I'm going to do just a select all from that dim product table. As we can see, we've got data that's been loaded into that table. Then I can run a query on the web telemetry data that was imported. So again, I'm just going to use a simple aggregate function to count the number of rows that's in the table. So if we run that, wait a few seconds to get the results back. And we can see we've got browse product, purchase product, and put in basket. So that's dedicated SQL pools on day 2. Now on day 3, we can look at serverless SQL pools. So I've got some data in a data lake in both CSV, in a delimited file format, but also Parquet in an analytical file format. So with my data lake, I'm going to browse through a folder structure. So I've got year, I have month, and I've got the date itself. If we have a look inside that folder, I've got a whole bunch of CSV files. Now I want to query the data within those CSV files without having to load that data into another data store, such as dedicated. So we can do that with serverless SQL pools. Now if I open up my script, what I can do is I can actually create a brand new database. We'll call it SQL Festive Tech 22. I'm just going to switch to the master database, and I'm going to run to create that database. It'll take a few seconds to run. Now I can switch to using that database and start creating some objects inside that serverless database. So I'll create a schema. I can create some credentials to be able to access the data that's in that data lake. And I'm using the Synapse Workspace managed identity. I'm going to create an external data source that points to that data lake and that container within the data lake. I'll also enable UTF support for Parquet files in that database too. So now that we've created our database and our connection to the data lake, we can start selecting data. So I'm going to run this select query on the CSV data that's in the data lake. I've defined a schema by using the with statement. So all those columns that are present in the CSV file, I've represented here. All of the information that I need is in that open row set command, and I've been able to query the data that's sat in that data lake. What I can also do is I can create objects, I can create views and external tables, because we might want to hide some of the complexity of the open row set command. So I can actually create a view select data from my data lake. I'm going to select from a Parquet data source. If I run that, I've added 3 columns that use the file path function, and this file path function can expose the folder structure in the data lake, and I can actually use that to filter. And lastly, if I just do a simple select top 10 from my view, I have my data back. And views in serverless are very useful to expose that data to other applications such as Power BI. Welcome to day 4, in which we have the ability to create Spark workloads in Synapse Analytics. So I've already created a Spark pool. I've got a large cluster, and I've got a notebook written in Python. So the first thing I'm going to do is just declare a parameter. It's a table that I would like to load data from my data lake, and I'd like to load that into the Delta file format. I'm going to load some utilities, and I'm also going to mount the data lake storage account using a linked service to my cluster so that I can then access the data that's available within that data lake. So we'll leave that running for a few seconds. Now that the data lake has been mounted, I can specify a source and destination folder. So I'm just going to save that there. And I'm going to read data in from that source folder. And I'm going to add a new column. I'm just going to add the Spark job ID to the data frame of data. So we'll let that run for a few seconds. Now that the job is finished, what I'll do is I'll write that data frame back out to the storage account in the Delta format. So if I run that, what that will now do is that's going to write the data from the data frame out into a folder in the data lake, but now using the Delta format. And what I can do is I can either use Spark to read that Delta data, or I can use Serverless SQL Pools to read that data using the Delta supported open row set command. And now that that write data process has finished, it's taken that data from the data frame and it's written it out to the Delta format back in our data lake, ready for querying with either Spark or Serverless SQL Pools. Now in day 5, we're going to take a quick look at Data Explorer pools. So this is the Azure Data Explorer service that's been brought in to Synapse Analytics. And it's useful for analyzing data in real time, especially log data and telemetry data. Now we're going to have a look at just ingesting data into the Data Explorer pool itself. So on the Develop tab, I actually have a special area for KQL scripts or Custo query language, and I'm going to create a table. Okay, so this is the storm events table. So I'm going to scroll down and run that against the Data Explorer pool. Then what I can do is I can ingest data into that table from a storage account. So I'm going to run the ingestion process. And again, this is all using KQL, which incidentally is the same language that is used in Azure Log Analytics. And finally, when it's imported that data, we can run a query. Now, sort by start time descending is we're going to sort the data by the start time. And we're also just going to select 10 rows using that take 10. So if I expand that, we've got 10 rows of telemetry that we've loaded in from the data lake into the Data Explorer pools. Welcome to day 6, in which we'll look at Synapse pipelines. Now I'm back in Synapse Studio and I'm on the Integrate tab, and I've got folders for where all my pipelines are stored. I've got a Festive Tech 2022. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new pipeline except I'm going to do it from a template. I love templates because I can create a pipeline once, I can create the definition of a pipeline and then reuse that multiple times. So I'm going to browse the gallery. I'm going to search for my template and I've got a pipeline load data lake from SQL. So I'm going to click that and click continue. I get a preview of the pipeline and my linked services. So I have a linked service to the data lake that I wish to store the file, and I have a linked service to the Azure SQL database that I would like to extract the data from. So I'm going to open that pipeline, and we can see that we already have that pipeline pretty much created for us. Okay, so it's going to go to a SQL database, look up some tables to extract, and it's going to load those into the data lake. So what I'll do, I'll amend this parameter down the bottom here, because I have a data lake folder. So raw festive tech. So I'm going to change that to raw festive tech / sales data. Now let's debug that and click OK. It'll take a few seconds to spin up the pipeline to run and export that SQL data. So I'm going to refresh that a couple of times. And because it's a for each table, it's going to go and it's going to trigger that load for each table in a loop. What we'll do is we'll jump into the data lake, we'll refresh, and we'll give it a few seconds, and there we go. So we can see our sales data folder. If we browse in there, all of our data is now being exported to the data lake. So let's look at sales order detail. I can see that I have a Parquet file there, and I can do a little quick test. I can right click and I can select the top 100 rows and run that and see the data within that file. So we go back to the pipeline and refresh. We can see that the pipeline has succeeded. Welcome to day 7, where we'll look at Power BI integration with Synapse Analytics, and specifically Synapse Studio. So I'm here in my linked services, and I'm going to create a new connection to Power BI. Actually, very handily enough, it's popped up to connect to Power BI. So I'm going to click Power BI, and I'm just going to name this Synapse Workspace or Synapse Analytics. And I'm going to select from my Power BI tenant a pre-existing workspace. Now this is actually an empty workspace that I've created. It is a pro workspace, so this works without having to have premium. And I'll save that link service. Now what I can do is, under my develop area, if I go into Power BI, I can see that I've got this Power BI datasets link. So what I can do is I can create a new Power BI dataset. I can select a data source. So what I'll do is I'm going to select my existing dedicated SQL pool, but you can select a serverless SQL pool as well. And it'll ask me to download a pbids file, which is essentially a data source connection file. If I open that file, it's going to open Power BI Desktop and automatically connect to my dedicated SQL pool so that we can see it's connecting. And I should be able to browse tables very soon. So here we go. So what I'll do is I'm just going to be very quick and just load a couple of tables, load those in. I'm going to import those into my Power BI dataset. And from here, once the data's been loaded in, I can do any modeling that I need, create relationships, create measures, etc., and publish. And what I'll do is I'll publish back to my dataset. So I'll say Synapse Analytics. and I'll put it into that Synapse Analytics workspace that I've linked to within Synapse Analytics. And once that's been published, I'm going to flick back to Synapse Studio and carry on working with that data set there. So from here, I'll go back into Synapse Studio. I'll close and refresh, and now I have that data set available within Synapse Workspace. So now I can actually click the little report icon, and what I'll do is I'll hide these windows, and now I've got access to be able to build a report within Synapse Studio itself. Welcome to day 8, in which we're going to look at data governance with Purview. So I'm in the Purview Studio. I've already connected my Purview environment to my Synapse Analytics workspace and scanned my dedicated SQL pool and also my Serverless SQL Pools databases. So we can have a look at that on the data map. Okay, and in my collection topology, I have my Azure Synapse Analytics workspace already connected and scanned. If we have a little look at the details, we can see we have a scan, we have a last run status, and we have some discovered and classified assets. Now what we can do is we can go into the data catalog area in Purview, and I can start to browse and search assets. So let me click Browse Assets firstly, and we can either select by the collection itself or by the source type. So I'm going to search by collection in my analytics collection. Okay, and as you can see, I've got a whole list of all the resources that Purview has scanned and brought in and tagged. So what I can do is I can search, or I can sort by name or by relevance, and I can narrow down by selecting a classification of that information in there. And if I go into something like dim customer, I'll be able to see that it's actually classified certain aspects of this table. If I go into properties, I can see some properties. If I go into the schema, I'll be able to see the schema of that table. If I go back to the data catalog and search, and this time if I search for customers, then I'll get everything associated to that search keyword. So Purview is excellent for connecting to data sources like Synapse Analytics, scanning and loading in the metadata for you to search for all your tables and objects. Welcome to day 9, in which we'll take a quick look at network security in Synapse Analytics. Now I'm back in the Azure portal where we can see all my existing Synapse workspaces. I'm going to create a new workspace so that we can see the network options. Now what I'll do is I'll skip the first page where it asks me for the details about the workspace, and we'll go to the networking tab. Now currently this is only possible when you create a Synapse workspace. You can't amend the setting afterwards. But what we can do is we can enable what's called a managed virtual network. And what this will do is this will create the Synapse Analytics workspace within a Microsoft managed VNet. Then what we can do is we can create private endpoints to be able to communicate with the services inside that Synapse workspace, like dedicated SQL pools and serverless SQL pools, but also outbound access as well, because there are data exfiltration policies that we can apply. So for example, I can only allow outbound data traffic to specific targets. So I can actually add any Azure Active Directory tenants that this Synapse Analytics workspace can communicate with. I'll select no on that, and we can disable public network access, and we'll have to use private endpoints to be able to connect into that Synapse Analytics workspace. So this locks down, this hardens the network perimeter around the Synapse Analytics workspace and only allows approved services in and also connectivity out of Synapse by using private endpoints. Welcome to day 10, in which we'll look at the Database Designer and Lake databases. Now on my Data tab in Synapse Studio, I can create a new Lake database using the Database Designer. So I'll click the plus and go into Lake Database. And this brings up a Design Studio. What I'll do is I'm just going to pop out into full screen mode. And now what we can do is we can actually connect to a data lake storage account. And I'm going to browse to a curated data area where I have some dimensions and facts that I would like to create tables for. So I'm going to call this Web Data Warehouse V2. And the data is stored in Parquet format. And now what I can do is I can create tables. So top left, I can create from a template. So there are some industry standard templates that I can use, or for myself, I'm going to go and create them from data in a data lake. So I'm going to choose my storage account and I'm going to browse to where that data is. So as I said, we go to the curated and I have some dimensions and facts. So what I'll do is I'm going to pick a dim date dimension. I'll call the table dim date. And when I preview the data, it'll analyze. Well, I know that there's no strings longer than 100, so we'll limit the max length of a string. If we preview the data, then we can see we get data back from the data lake. If I create that, you can now see we've actually got a visual representation of that table. What I'll do is I'll also bring in another table from the data lake, which is the fact table. So I'll browse back down into my data lake. I'll go to my curated and I have a fact table called Fact Internet Sales. I'll bring that in. I'll call that Fact Internet Sales. And I should have a preview of that data. Again, I'll set the max string length there for optimization, and we can see we get data back. Okay, so that's my fact table. If I create that, again, we'll get a visual representation on here. Now what we can do, we can actually create relationships between these tables. Now this doesn't do anything itself in terms of any referential integrity. However, if you import this data via Power BI, it'll respect those relationships and pull them in. So what we can do is we can click on relationships and set a relationship to a table. So what we'll say is we'll go from dim date, the date key column, to the fact table on the order date key column. And there you can see that it's referenced that order date key as a foreign key. Now what we can do is we can publish this, and this will be available in the Lake database area. So I'm just going to minimize that in this Lake database area here. And it'll be available for querying using Synapse Studio, SSMS, or Power BI. Welcome to day 11, in which we're going to look at Synapse Link. Now this is a way of synchronizing certain source data into a Synapse workspace. And one of those is the Dataverse. So I've got a Dynamics 365 sales dashboard open at the moment, and I'd like to synchronize my Dynamics 365 data for external analytics within Synapse. So what I'll do is I'll go to Power Apps, and under the Dataverse Azure Synapse Link, I can create a new link. Now I'll connect it to a Synapse workspace, and I'll select the subscription and the resource group that my Synapse workspace is in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick the resource group Synapse UK, and my Synapse Analytics workspace and storage account will appear. So if I click next, I'm going to select some tables. I'm just going to select the account and the contact table. And when I save that, it's setting some permissions at the top left to be able to write to the data lake in unattended, or when it's synchronizing data automatically. So it should take a few seconds to save that information. While we're doing that, I'll actually switch to the Synapse Workspace itself. So if I go into the Synapse Workspace, we should see a database appear under the Lake databases. And in fact, there we go. The Dataverse Sales Trial Lake database has appeared. Let's see if it's created any tables yet. So we can refresh and we'll start to see tables appearing under there. Let's go back to Power Apps. So now the setup of the Synapse Link for the Dataverse is finished, and we can go in and we can check the status. So if we click on the link itself, we can actually see that we've got a sync status of post-processing. We've got some row counts there. We've got 8 rows in the account table and 13 rows in the contact table. So now that we see the synchronization status of the tables is active, that means it's successfully synchronized the tables to the Azure Data Lake, and now Synapse Analytics can read from that data. So we'll go back in to the Synapse Studio, and we can see we've got our account table and contact table in the Lake database. And if we run a select over that database and table, we can get our data back. Now, if we go back into Dynamics and change any data, that data will be synchronized automatically into the data lake and be visible in our Lake database. Welcome to our last day, day 12, which is source control in Synapse Analytics. Now, I'm back in Synapse Studio, and what I can do from the Manage area is set up source control. So I'm going to click on Git configuration down the bottom, and I can click configure. Now this actually allows me to either connect to Azure DevOps or GitHub. Now I'm going to connect to Azure DevOps, and I'm going to select my directory and then continue. I can choose my repository and the project name. So I'm going to click to my analytics project, and we'll call this DH Synapse CICD-UAT. I'm going to keep my collaboration branch as master, and I'm going to apply. And what that'll do is that'll create the repository in the Azure DevOps Git area, and I'll be able to commit and source control all the development items within my Synapse Workspace. So I'll save that, and now I can see that my repository is up and running. So if I go into integrate, for example, and I already have a pipeline up and running, if I were to change this pipeline, let's say add a copy data task, what I can do is I can actually commit those changes to the Git repository, and I can also publish those changes onto the working version of the Synapse Pipelines service. Thank you very much for watching this session. I hope it's been useful. If you scan the QR code, it'll take you to the fundraising page for the Missing People charity, a great cause. Anything would be much appreciated. And I hope you have an enjoyable rest of Festive Tech Calendar 2022.